Thank you so much for joining Columbia Riverkeeper's webinar today. My name is Lauren Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of Columbia Riverkeeper. Our organization's mission is to protect and restore water quality in the Columbia River and all life connected to it. And the way that we do that is by uniting communities to work in solidarity with tribal governments to make an impact for our climate, for clean water, and for salmon recovery. I want to thank you for joining today. Our work is powered by people, including many who are here with us today, who have a shared passion for the lifeblood of the Pacific Northwest, the Columbia River, and for climate action. I want to thank our supporters for making our advocacy and our public education work like today's webinar possible. So thank you so much again for joining. We will have an incredible hour filled with three panelists who are going to unpack the so-called nuclear renaissance that is being advanced by big tech and the Trump administration. They will be honing in on three distinct yet inextractable pieces of the puzzle. They'll be discussing nuclear energy and the myth of nuclear reprocessing, why adding new nuclear development to the Hanford Nuclear Site is a non-starter, and how nuclear energy and data centers are creating a new wave of environmental injustices for Indigenous communities and for tribal governments. So to kick off our webinar today, we'll begin with a land acknowledgement. We at Columbia Riverkeeper recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Native people and their traditional territories. We want to respectfully acknowledge that the places that we're all joining today's webinar from rest on the traditional lands of Native people who've cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial, and they continue to do so today. I'm joining from the Columbia River Gorge from Columbia Riverkeeper's Hood River, Oregon office, which rests on the traditional lands of the Wasco Wishrum, the Warm Springs, and Yakima Nation. To learn more about tribal governments, we encourage you to visit their websites or to consider attending an event that's open to the public. There are many happening this summer. So a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we start with our speakers. If you have a question for our speakers, please add it to the Q&A feature in Zoom. It's at the bottom of your screen. I will do my best to cover as many questions as we can in our last 15 minutes or so. Also, if you're having any issues with Zoom, feel free to pop a question in the Q&A, and our tech support, Wanda, will try to help you troubleshoot. And finally, if you can't stick around for the entire webinar or you are really inspired by it and want to share it with friends or colleagues, we will be posting a recording on our website, and if you RSVP'd, you'll also receive an email with that recording as well as some of the resources that our speakers talk about. So just keep an eye out for that in your email. And finally, I just want to encourage you to follow Columbia Riverkeeper on social media. You can sign up for our emails on our website, or if you're already receiving emails, keep an eye out for updates because we'll be sharing those in the months to come, including updates on the topics we're covering today. So with that, I'm honored to introduce our speakers. First, we'll hear from my colleague, Simone, who is Columbia Riverkeeper's Senior Attorney and Cleanup Hanford Program Director. Simone works very closely with the Confederated Tribes and Bands of Yakima Nation to support increased public engagement in the Hanford Nuclear Site cleanup. She also serves as an alternate on the Hanford Advisory Board, and she works to engage people of all levels to hold the U.S. government accountable for its cleanup obligations at Hanford. Her work also focuses on lending legal support to other Columbia Riverkeeper campaigns, including the Protect Pushbone campaign and our No Nuclear campaigns. Simone is a descendant of the Jicarilla Apache and Yaqui, and she earned her JD from UCLA's School of Law, where she received a specialization in critical race theory with a focus on federal Indian law. Following Simone's presentation, we'll hear from Arjun Makhijani, who's the president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, or IEER. which focuses on providing activists, policymakers, and journalists and the public with understandable and accurate scientific and technical information on energy and environmental issues. Dr. Makhijani holds a PhD in engineering with a specialization in nuclear fusion from the University of California at Berkeley. He has published many studies and articles on nuclear fuel cycle related issues, including weapons production, testing, nuclear waste, over the past 20 years. He is also the author of Prosperous Renewable Maryland, which is based on an hour-by-hour modeling of the Maryland electricity sector. He's authored Carbon Free and Nuclear Free, which is a roadmap for US energy policy, and was the first analysis of the transition to a US economy based completely on renewable energy without any fossil fuels or nuclear power. He's the principal author of the first study ever done, which was completed in 1971 on energy conservation potential in the US economy. And he's the principal editor of Nuclear Wastelands and the principal author of Mending the Ozone Hole, which are both published by MIT Press. I could go on and on, but I will stop there. We'll wrap up our speakers today with a presentation from Krystal Tubles, who's the executive director of Honor the Earth. Krystal is an Ogallala, Lakota, and Northern Cheyenne grassroots organizer with experience on the front lines doing campaign development and management around social, racial, and environmental justice. Krystal's identity as a Native American veteran is central to her organizing and her storytelling. At the heart of Krystal's work is sovereignty, land back, cross-movement relationship building, and a deep commitment to her people. In healing from her experience as a veteran, Krystal has dedicated herself to embodying what she views as the essential quality of a warrior, a commitment to the well-being of not only her people and their relationship to the land, but of all peoples. So a huge thank you to our incredible speakers today, and I'm excited to kick off with Columbia Riverkeeper's Senior Attorney, Simone. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. So when talking about new nuclear development, we inevitably need to talk about the radioactive pollution legacy that nuclear has caused in our region and frankly, across the country and the world. So today I'm going to begin our conversation at the Hanford Nuclear Site, where cleanup, energy, and data centers are on a collision course. Next slide, please. So Hanford is, there we go. So Hanford is depicted in yellow on this map, and over nearly 5 decades, the site produced 2/3 of the nation's plutonium, and plutonium production released hundreds of billions of gallons of liquid chemical and radioactive waste into the soil and groundwater. So everything that wasn't plutonium remains on site today, including millions of gallons of chemicals used to extract plutonium from spent nuclear fuel. So the US government built 177 underground storage tanks in the center of the site to contain some of the worst radionuclide laced chemicals and some of the most harmful liquid waste from this process. But what didn't go into these tanks ultimately went straight into the environment. So due to unchecked militarism, Hanford is now known as the most contaminated site in the Western Hemisphere. So the area's mission transitioned to cleanup in the late 1980s with the signing of the tri-party agreement between the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the state of Washington. So today, cleanup deadlines stretch as far as 2090 with a myriad of complex challenges surrounding how to clean up the types of waste here and how to safely store long-term nuclear waste. Now, to exacerbate these challenges, we're seeing developers and big tech beginning to eye Hanford greedily for new nuclear development. This is a prospect that threatens to derail and deprioritize cleanup. Next slide, please. So when We talk about nuclear energy in these proposals. I like to start with a common premise and start with the waste. And for me, it's really important that this conversation begins with an understanding that every curie of radioactive waste created is here to stay. And dealing with nuclear waste is a multi-generational burden. It doesn't go away. It's multi-generational, it's expensive, and it's unresolved. And so now the company X Energy, with backing from Amazon, wants to add a new waste stream to the site, which is very problematic. Next slide, please. So the proposal is to build small modular nuclear reactors, or SMNRs, in Hanford's 300 area, close to the region's only nuclear energy plant, the Columbia Generating Station, which is operated by Energy Northwest. So if you look in the bottom of this map, the 300 area is located in the bottom right-hand corner, and it's 2 miles north of the city of Richland, Washington, and adjacent to the Columbia River. This area of Hanford remains one of the most important sites for focused cleanup along the river and poses a lot of complex challenges that are unresolved and have yet to be addressed. So while the industry likes to present SMNRs as new, they really are just repackaged older nuclear power plant designs, only smaller. So they usually produce about 300 megawatts each versus an older reactor model, which is around 1,200 megawatts. They also produce 2 to 30 times the radioactive waste of older nuclear designs. So legally, this waste, which is spent nuclear fuel, is considered it's considered high-level waste under both the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and the Atomic Energy Act. And under both of those acts, it must be vitrified, which means turned into glass, and disposed of in a deep geological repository. However, the high-level waste vitrification plant at Hanford is not yet operational, and we have no deep geological repository for this type of nuclear waste. So like other high-level nuclear waste streams on site, the SMNR created waste has no long-term, safe, and legal way to be treated or disposed of. So this means the areas where SMNRs are sited become a de facto high-level waste storage site. Next slide, please. So the 300 area of Hanford, like I said before, has been rife with really complicated cleanup challenges, and the presence of nuclear energy here has already interfered with cleanup. So in this picture, you can see the Columbia Generating Station, and in the area right in front, demarcated by the yellow border, this is the 61811 burial ground, which is located partially under CGS's parking lot, which in the upper left of that yellow outline, you can see that light gray area. That is a parking lot for the facility. So the 61811 burial ground contains highly radioactive waste, and cleanup of the source material in 61811 conflicts with operation of CGS, namely that to keep workers safe, operations at the facility would need to pause. So this conflict has delayed cleanup so far. In order to characterize this waste site, the Department of Energy must engage and coordinate with Energy Northwest, who runs CGS. But unlike the federal government, Energy Northwest, they have no cleanup obligations or deadlines. And what we've seen so far is an engagement that has been piecemeal and incomplete, meaning that as of right now, the government doesn't know exactly what's in the waste site or how to begin safe remediation. Next slide, please. Now, with radioactive contamination, it's often not about what you can see, but what you can't see. So this photo shows a snapshot of a groundwater plume below the 61811 burial ground and below CGS, and this is a tritium plume. So there are both major tritium, radioactive tritium, and toxic nitrate plumes that are extending from the radioactive burial ground. You can kind of see how they seep under CGS and loop around the backside. Several years ago, Energy assumed that this plume would reduce over time because tritium has a relatively short half-life. However, due to unknown contents in the burial ground, what we've actually seen is that the levels have been maintained or actually increased. They have spiked in recent years, which means probably most likely something in the burial ground broke, releasing more tritium. And so we're not quite sure moving forward if there will be more spikes like that. So in this area, there was another nearby burial ground called the 61810, which most likely contained similar waste to what would be in 61811. And this burial ground posed serious risk when remediated because the contents caught fire when exposed to oxygen. And it took about an 8-year effort to remediate the 61810 site, which was less complicated than the 61811 burial ground in terms of proximity to unshielded workers and high activity waste. Next slide, please. So this is the location of the proposed new SMNRs. So Energy Northwest, Amazon, and X Energy want to locate more nuclear waste generating activities, including nuclear reactors, right adjacent to this area. And for us, this raises several questions. So what are the public and worker safety implications of excavating 61811? So if there's active development in the area, what exposure risk does remediation pose to workers working on the site and additional workers who will be in this area working? And then also fire and dust suppression water associated with increased development could also exacerbate the movement of the contaminants that we're seeing in the groundwater. Another question is, will cleanup of 61811 be delayed or will it be rushed? And how will new groundwater data from increased monitoring that has been put into place in this area, how will that need to change the area cleanup plan that governs the site? Right now, TPA milestones still suggest that cleanup is going to proceed with the remediation to begin in 2030. And then another question is, how can new development be permitted in an area where cleanup is lagging, difficult, and stalled already because of current commercial operations? In other areas of the Hanford site, groundwater plumes have remained untreated and in some cases exempted from cleanup standards because of the presence of development on the surface makes it impossible in this moment to clean it up. And the 300 area is located far too close to the Columbia River to allow groundwater plumes to remain above drinking water standards. Next slide, please. So the question, is Hanford cleanup being sidelined? I don't know an answer to this question, but I will end with a few things that I do know for sure about efforts to develop SMNRs and data centers on site at Hanford. So first, the Trump administration is defunding Hanford cleanup. So for fiscal year 2027, Trump is proposing a $400 million budget cut. This is combined with the U.S. House's proposed budget cut of $55 million for cleanup. So this would leave Hanford's budget at roughly $2.77 billion. The state of Washington estimates that $6.76 billion is needed for cleanup in 2027, a number that is far above the proposed budget and only gets more and more expensive. The next thing that we know is Hanford lost 37% of its federal staff who oversee cleanup in the last year. So this includes what they like to call mission critical staff, so scientists and engineers. And less staff means less oversight of the cleanup and of contractors, as well as less institutional knowledge. Now Hanford's Richland office, I believe, has 170 plus open positions there. Next, we know the Trump administration is deregulating nuclear safety and environmental standards, a move which will speed up permitting while reducing safety. So this includes limiting oversight and independence of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC, which is responsible for permitting these types of places, and then the Defense Nuclear Safety Board. It also includes efforts to exempt new nuclear development from Federal Environmental Review, or NEPA review. We also know that where there is nuclear energy, data centers inevitably come up. So a data center is proposed at the Pacific Northwest National Lab, or PNNL, which is located in Hanford's 300 area, as well as one in nearby Richland, Washington. And then lastly, we know that Amazon has invested $500 million in X Energy's SMNR proposal and plans to use the SMNRs to power data centers. Last slide, please. So, nuclear waste that remains at Hanford is both complex, expensive, and far from complete. It should serve as a concrete reminder of why we need to focus on cleanup and not add to our nuclear waste burden and impede current cleanup efforts. And 61811 is one very proximate example, but there are plenty of others in the 300 area. So, we Columbia Riverkeeper has a new report coming out called Hanford Cleanup in the Age of Nuclear Uncertainty that takes a look at more of these issues. So definitely check it out when it comes out. And with that, I will pass it over to our next panelist, Dr. Makhijani. Thank you.
It looks like you're still on mute, but we can see your screen.
Okay. All right. Start again.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I'm going to talk about nuclear power plants, small modular reactors, and reprocessing. I'll tell you what that is. Nuclear power. Okay. So this is a nuclear power plant. It's a pressurized water reactor. So the nuclear part of it is just a boiler. This thing under the dome here. That's the reactor. That's where the steam is made in a pressurized water reactor. This is just like a coal-fired power plant, except the fire is inside the reactor instead of outside the boiler. Otherwise, it's just a boiler. The rest of the power plant is just like a coal-fired power plant. You have steam, you have a turbine, you have a generator. Two-thirds of the energy goes into the condenser. This is the water. In this case, it will come from the Columbia River, rejected back as heated up water into the Columbia River. So two-thirds of the energy goes into waste heat, into the water body. Here, the Columbia River, it will be and is from the Columbia Generating Station, and one-third goes out as electricity. So a little bit of history. In the first round, 60s, 70s, heyday of nuclear power, they wanted to build 1,000 power plants. Lots were ordered, but 203 actually began licensing proceedings. But then there were cost increases, delays. The growth of electricity went down much less than anticipated. I actually warned them about that in 1976. I said, watch out, don't build so many power plants because you may have no use for them. Anyway, 59% were completed and the rest were canceled in various stages of completion. And as a result of the delays, cancellations, cost increases, cost overruns, Forbes magazine, not known as an anti-nuclear rag, said in February 1985, the failure of the U.S. nuclear power program ranks as the largest managerial disaster in business history, a disaster on a monumental scale. So that was when 59% were completed with delays and cost increases. Then nuclear power went into a kind of slumber for new nuclear power plants. Natural gas was cheap, and no nuclear power plants were ordered, and none were being built, except one from the 70s that was completed in the 90s. And then there was all this stuff about climate change. Now we're going to have a nuclear renaissance, a low carbon source. Um, so the Nuclear Regulatory Commission actually built a new building to accommodate the rush of paperwork. And there were 31 announcements, including one, if I remember correctly, was in Hawaii County, Idaho, led by some people who were running laundromats in the Northeast, with the head of that organization being a former retired chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, if I'm remembering correctly. That didn't go anywhere. Anyway, out of these 31, 23 started licensing proceedings, certification proceedings with the NRC, and two were completed. 14 billion initial cost estimate, 36 billion complete. The other two of the others actually started being built, canceled after $9 billion. So 36 plus 9, 45. And then the others were canceled without actually a lot of earth being moved. That, by my estimate, was roughly $5 billion. So we got two reactors out of $50 billion. Completion rate 9%, not a fantastic learning curve. First round 59%, biggest managerial disaster. Second round 9%. Forbes hasn't written about this yet, but that's because there were not that many reactors that were canceled the first round. Remember, it was so many dozens of reactors, scores of reactors canceled. Okay, small modular reactors. So the large reactors are not, looking so good, take too long, too many delays, cost overruns. So let's build small reactors that we can build in an assembly line, and have a supply chain of parts and sort of bring it on a truck to the site and set it up. And that way it'll be faster, better, and cheaper. But nuclear reactors are big for a reason. It's called economies of scale. The bigger the volume of the reactor, that's more the power capacity, the smaller the cost per kilowatt. So you have to compensate for that in some way. And they say, we'll compensate for it by doing assembly line manufacture and simplified designs. What do we mean by assembly line manufacture? We're not talking your Model T Ford or your Toyota Camrys. You're talking something more like a Boeing Dreamliner or an Airbus 350. Now, Boeing's, of course, and Airbuses have assembly lines, but they don't make millions. They make dozens, scores, hundred. And the scale is similar. So a Boeing Dreamliner costs about $250 million. A 77 megawatt new scale reactor designed at Oregon State University, light water reactor design. If its cost can be brought down to $7,000 a kilowatt, a project was proposed and canceled at the point where it was estimated at 20,000. So I'm being very generous to reduce cost by a factor of 3. You're going to do all these wonderful things. And so it will cost $540 million a piece. So you're going to make a few dozen of these and have a supply chain. Nobody's going to build a supply chain unless you have orders, and you're not going to build an assembly line until you have orders. That's why, when the first small modular reactor was proposed, I wrote about this 13 years ago. An advantage of being old is that I've been there, I've written about so much of this stuff. The TVA was going to build one, and the chief engineer was very honest about it. He said, this is a first of a kind, what is called FOAK, folk. Um, the, he said that the first of a kind will be cobbled together. That's a quote. But you need, lots of orders before you can build this supply. Do you want a reactor that's cobbled together? I don't. Anyway, simplified design. So simplified design could reduce costs, but both these things raise new issues. So what's the history experience so far compared to round one and round two? So, round one was fool me once, round two was fool me twice, and now we're into round three. Looks like fool me thrice. So Department of Energy said in 2000, small modular reactor designs would be, quote, available for deployment by 2010. The first one didn't even apply for certification until 2016. That was the new scale 50 megawatt one. They got a certification with an asterisk in about 2020. And the asterisk was absolutely huge. I'll talk about it in a minute, but they were going to build 12 of these 50 megawatt ones at the Idaho National Lab. The initial cost was $4,000 kilowatt. They had a few customers signed up to buy the electricity, but only about 1/5 of the electricity had customers. So they reduced the size, the cost went up. And by the time it was canceled and nobody really wanted the electricity, it was up to $20,000 a kilowatt. So now we're 26 years from this announcement that it will be ready for deployment by 2010, and 16 years from 2010, and the batting record is 0. So we're not doing too well. All right. So what are the problems with these two cost reduction things? Assembly line manufacturing is great, does reduce costs, all the way back to Henry Ford, Model Ts. We know that. But we also know that assembly line manufacture has a risk. You manufacture the same widget multiple times in the same factory, and you risk recalls. So Boeing Dreamliners were recalled after they were certified and were flying passengers. They found a problem with the battery, and they had to ground all of them. How are we going to recall nuclear reactors that are, and then what is going to happen to the electricity supply? Now you got 200 of these widgets. They're providing electricity to the grid. One breaks down. Now let me talk about that asterisk with the new scale reactor that's been certified. It's got a simplified design without pumps, natural circulation of water in the reactor to make the heat. So new design of a steam steam generator. It's helical. It can have vibrations. And this problem was called out by the advisory board on reactor safeguards of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that could lead to failure. And it was certified anyway. So we're not talking a theoretical thing about recalls. We already know that there is a problem in the only SMR that's been certified. And what did the NRC say in certifying it and overruling the risk assessment expert on their advisory committee who didn't think it should be certified till the problem was resolved? Let's build one and we'll see. Not, I mean, that's not a quote, obviously. That was the spirit of the certification. Not the way I want to have a nuclear reactor in my neighborhood. Okay, so there are lots of other issues with nuclear power. One is called opportunity costs. So we had the nuclear renaissance starting in 2005. How much electricity have we generated from nuclear from 2005 to 2024 when the renaissance came to an end with these two expensive reactors? 40 terawatt hours, 40 million megawatt hours. In the same period, new wind and solar generated 120 times as much electricity. So you can count the cost to climate, you can count the cost to CO2 because now you're burning fossil fuels that could have been displaced if you instead invested. So there's a loss of time, there's a loss of money, and there's an increase of risk. Yeah. So you don't want to be the person with the first of a kind risk and or even the second or third of a kind risk. I know, yeah, I don't favor nuclear power, but if you do, you want to be a little more cautious given the history of these folks. So, this is a uranium mine. This is you're leaking uranium mill tailings. This is depleted uranium. About 6 out of 7 kilograms of natural uranium that's mined and refined goes into depleted uranium, which is depleted in the fissile material. Now, I want to end this nuclear power part of this presentation by giving you a little pro-nuclear recitation, the way it's done by nuclear power folks. These are nuclear fuel pellets. They sit in these pencil-thin fuel rods. And they'll tell you, each one of these very energy dense, all correct, absolutely right. It's about, a little more than a fourth of an ounce. And each one of these little beasts will generate 1,600 kilowatt hours of electricity in a year. That's a lot of electricity from a little pellet like that. But each little pellet has, 6.5 kilograms of uranium that's in those depleted uranium cylinders. And each natural uranium has 500, each ton of natural uranium has 500 tons in the mill tailings because ores are typically 0.2%, 0.1%, 0.3%. Some ores are very rich. Canadian ores are richer, but that's the US history. And then for each ore, ton of ore that's mined, there is a lot of mine waste. And the ratio of uranium mined, uranium produced, out of which 6 out of 7 kilograms is in depleted uranium, to mine waste is about 9,000. So now, to supply one typical US household with nuclear electricity, you're using up only a few of these pellets, but you're creating 3 metric tons of mine waste. Now, US is creating mine waste not in the United States anymore. The US has basically imported the vast majority of uranium requirements. But how much mine waste was accumulated? What is 5 to 10 billion metric tons? It's 500,000 to 1 million football fields from end to end, 1 meter deep, a little more than 3 feet deep. That's a lot more football fields than we have. Reprocessing. Okay. Reprocessing is when you take these spent fuel rods after they're irradiated, they're spent fuel. Now they're, have highly radioactive fission products in them. There's plutonium in them, and you're separating the plutonium. So you put it in an acid bath. This is the flow diagram of the acid bath. This is the commercial technology. It's called the Purex process, plutonium uranium extraction. And there's a different technology called electrometallurgical processing, pyroprocessing, developed in Idaho, not commercialized, but is proposed to be joined with every reactor. Potentially, it's called the integral fast reactor concept. This is a sodium-cooled reactor. The company, the one with the Swiss chalet, um, I forget the name of the company now. It'll come to me in a second, I hope. They plan to build an electrometallurgical reactor. So what's wrong with reprocessing? So when you separate plutonium, you're creating weapons usable material. The advertisement for this has been that this is proliferation resistant, but it's not proliferation proof. You can still use these separated materials to make nuclear weapons. That's not just my opinion. It was in a report written by Department of Energy National Labs. All right. So Oklo is the name of the company. I didn't need to rely on my memory. It's here in my slides. So Oklo is planning to build an electrometallurgical reprocessing plant. So what happens when you separate the plutonium? First of all, you're adding costs. You're creating liquid wastes. You're creating fission product waste stream, very highly radioactive, that you have now to contain. And why did we do this in the first place? Uranium was thought to be very scarce. And let me kind of skip this. Uranium was thought to be very scarce. And uranium, the fissile part, the one that fission splits and gives you energy, is 0.7% of natural uranium. U-238, which is not fissile, and I often joke that, maybe Mother Nature didn't want us to do all this stuff, make weapons and so on, because natural uranium is not very suitable, is not suitable at all for weapons and hard for power plants. Can be done, but hard. And but you can make U-238 into plutonium, which is fissile. So it was called a magical energy source. So here you have something that's not a fuel, that you can add a neutron to it in a reactor and make plutonium. Now, this happens in normal reactors, but in normal reactors, you don't make more plutonium than the fuel that you used up. So sodium-cooled reactors, what Oklo wants to do, can make more fuel than you consume. That's why it's called a magical energy source. It's kind of abracadabra. You start with a ton of fuel, you generate a whole bunch of energy, and then at the end, you have more fuel than you started with. Of course, the penalty is you have to do reprocessing. You're separating weapons usable material. You're adding to cost. You're adding to risk. So what happened? Sodium-cooled reactors were never commercialized. This was the big dream of the magical energy source. 100 billion with a B was spent to try to commercialize these reactors. They are not commercial. The most recent ones, were worse. Now at Hanford, they built one, the fast flux test facility. It worked pretty well. Try to say that really fast. It's kind of fun. The almost like first of a kind acronym. Yeah, so not commercial. So reprocessing plants were built with the idea that these reactors would be commercial, and then you put plutonium in the reactor and you won't have to mine uranium anymore because uranium was thought to be scarce. But uranium turned out to be quite plentiful. We built fewer reactors than projected, and reprocessing continued. It was fortunately commercial reprocessing was stopped in the United States around 1972. But in France, it continued. So here's what happens in a light water reactor. Now we're reprocessing light water reactors fuel and using the plutonium in light water reactors. And tell you what happens. What is called recycling. So people say we should really be recycling. And so I want to tell you what recycling spent fuel is about. So this is fresh fuel. It's 96% U-238. It's about 4% U-235. That's the fissile part, and trace U-234. When you use it up, you're using up most of your U-235. You're creating plutonium out of U-238 as the reactor operates, and you're generating some energy from that, and some plutonium is left unfissioned. So in the end, you have about 1% plutonium left. You have consumed a couple of 3% of this uranium-238 because it's made into plutonium. Some of it becomes U-236, and U-235 becomes U-236. Anyway, you've fissioned about 4.6% of this material. That becomes fission products. Most of the stuff left over is still uranium, 93, 94 more, 94 plus percent. All right. So, but this is 1%. That's what we're going to extract, and we're going to use that as fuel. Now, this is the material balance of how it looks, how recycling looks in France today. And I know French. I've studied the French waste system. I've led 3 teams writing about nuclear waste in France, including one which I presented, was it this week? I think it was this week in French to French stakeholders. You take 7.4 kilograms of natural uranium and make 1 kilogram of fuel. You use it in the reactor. That's what we do here. That's what everybody does that has light water reactors. 6.5 kilograms, 6.4 kilograms of depleted uranium. Now you're reprocessing 1 kilogram of fuel. You have 47 grams of fission products. You have 10 grams, 1% of plutonium. You mix that with depleted uranium and make fuel out of it. You re-enrich the uranium, this part. You go from 0.68 back to 4%. But most of that again becomes depleted uranium. Now, this looks like you can easily do it again and again and again and again, but you cannot because the plutonium in this is degraded isotopically. It's not all plutonium-239. It's not all fissile. The uranium, you got this nasty uranium-236, which absorbs neutrons, makes reactor operation quite complicated. But if you do it, assuming the physics of you goes swimmingly, in this system, which is called recycling by the nuclear industry today, you are not going to use more than 1% of your natural uranium input into the system. Not more than 1%. That is what we're called recycling today. And what is the waste consequence of that? I want to show you. So this is Department of Energy data, not mine. So this is what we do. Once through light water reactor, this is the spent fuel. This is greater than Class C waste. This is the total repository waste, greater than Class C plus in my what should happen in terms of how you manage this waste. Now, our repositories are the least bad. There's no good solution for this stuff. So then there's a whole bunch of low-level waste. Once through 150 to 585,000 I think, what are the units of this? Sorry, I haven't put units. I'll put units before I send it to you. This is tons, I know. This must be tons also. If you reprocess, what happens, you're creating a lot of plutonium contaminated waste, which is now quite radioactive. You're reducing the high level waste from 70 to 52, but you're increasing this part from 2,500 to more than 400,000. So in France, where they do this stuff, and where I've told you my institute has written 3 reports on their repository program. They're all on our website. One is even in English. Um, you are increasing the volume of waste, except the part, this they call this medium activity long-lived waste in France, which has to be disposed of in a repository. They are developing a repository. You don't avoid a repository by doing reprocessing. You're increasing this kind of waste. You're basically exchanging kinds of waste that needs to be disposed of. You're also greatly increasing low-level waste. Now, and you're dumping liquid wastes into the English Channel, but you know the French, it's the English Channel. Never mind. These are resources. I will send you these slides. That's the end of my presentation. It took long.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really fascinating. And I know we've had a number of questions, requests for the slide. So yeah, appreciate that. Why don't we go ahead, Krystal, and turn to you, and feel free to take your time. And if folks need to jump off, they can. We'll send the recording. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, I'll try to move through this pretty quickly. Let's see. I went ahead and closed and hid some of the slides. So we're going to move through this. Give me 1 second to get my view set up here. Second. Okay, there we go. Okay, so as introduced, my name is Krystal Tubal. So I'm in Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne. I'm currently residing just off the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in a small community called Colstrip. Called Colstrip because of the coal mining that exists here in the community. We're about, like I said, 15 miles north of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about the connection to generative AI, to hyperscale data centers, to nuclear power, other power, our energy sources, critical minerals, et cetera. But just really quick, want to talk about how I really came into this story of a small modular nuclear reactor was proposed for my community here in Colstrip as a replacement for the coal mining for Northwestern Energy. And so that was really what initiated the struggle for us and my organization. We quickly discovered that this was connected directly to powering hyperscale data centers, right? So the demand for that. And so that really threw us into this like large research project and really figuring out where these hyperscale data centers were proposed for, where they're coming from, who are the owners, all of those things. Through that research, we really quickly discovered that this is all the infrastructure for generative AI. And so really going back a bit, we call it, I see folks can see this, I apologize for the small writing on here. We call it the death cycle of AI. Really what this is pointing out the infrastructure, right? And so starting with the demand for, let me see if I can get this. Sorry if this is not changing yet. Okay. Starting with just like a simple understanding of like a really, really high level traditional AI, generative AI, right? Traditional AI is basically, it's artificial intelligence. It's a broad field of computer science that focuses primarily on analyzing and assessing and sorting data. Like very simple, right? That's essentially what that is. Generative AI, on the other hand, is actually creating new content based on the patterns that it's learning from analyzing, assessing, and sorting current data. So it's generating new content, right? Which is the driving force for the need for a hyperscale data center to house all of this new data and new content that's being created, right? So just starting there, moving into like just generally some impacts of generative AI is that oftentimes we lose our rights to the content that's uploaded, for example, into Chat GPT. And for example, for Native communities specifically, when we utilize those public platforms like Chat GPT or Claude or Gemini or any of those with our traditional languages, we actually lose our rights to those languages. It now belongs to those other parties. Also, just looking at cognitive offloading. So, for example, back in the day, I come from an era where we didn't have cell phones when I was a child. We just had home phones and we memorized the phone numbers, right? But when cell phones became a thing, we started to actually rely on the cell phones to have the phone numbers for us, and we no longer memorized them. That is an example of cognitive offloading, right? That is what's happening right now with our use of Chat GPT, generative AI, different generative AI platforms, right? But that leads to cognitive decline. So the more that we engage in generative AI, the more we actually experience cognitive decline. If you don't use it, you lose it. Our brain synapses start to prune, and we no longer have that skill set or that ability in our own mind, right? This is really important because when you look at the whole infrastructure of this, they're very much targeting lower income schools in poor communities to implement and use generative AI in the classroom. And they're doing that because they're using our schools as sandboxes. So they're testing on our children what the impacts and the long-term impacts will be from generative AI use, right? The other thing to note here is that wealthy school systems and even the inventors and the founders and the CEOs of all of these different, generative AI platforms, they do not allow their children to utilize generative AI, right? So it's really important to understand and to know what we are being used for. You also get into the realm of like the suicides and the murders that have been documented and tied to platforms such as Chat GPT, Grok, things like that, and also child pornography, where generative AI are creating images of children, right, for the use of pornography. We also have the fact that people are turning towards Chat GPT for conversations, emotional support, mental health support, things like that. And we have already cases documented of suicides and murders where Chat GPT or other platforms have literally told people how to commit suicide and went as far as giving them step-by-step instructions, or even how to commit murder and giving them step-by-step instructions, right? And so naming all of those. And then for Indigenous peoples and Native people specifically, there's already pictures and videos of our ceremonies that are sacred and private that are circulating the internet. They're not correct, they're not accurate, but they are circulating and they were not meant for that space, right? So it's also dangerous in terms of like appropriation, right? But the generative AI, like I said, is creating the demand for the physical manifestation of the hyperscale data center to hold the data. The cloud is not some invisible place up there. The cloud is actually a data center, right? There's many different sizes of data centers. And so it's really important to understand that there's differences. So when I say data center, I could be referring to a total of like 5 or more different sizes. You could have a data center that's just a small server, in the office building. It's a server room, right? But what we're worried about and what we're seeing is the demand for the hyperscale, which is the largest of all of the sizes of data centers. We're talking over 500 acres, right, of a data center, of a facility. Some of them are now moving up to like 10,000 square feet, right? So they're starting to be extremely large, larger than we can even comprehend at this moment. And so again, you have your traditional data centers. Those are just temperature controlled buildings full of computers. They're storing our data. And then you have the hyperscale, and that's looking at facilities that are about 10,000 square feet, built to house machines used to power generative AI specifically, right? And the top 5 hyperscalers in the world right now, so this is not just a US specific thing, this is a global issue, is Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Meta, and Apple, right? And then the scary thing is that when they approach our communities, they don't use those names. They use the names of their subsidiaries, right? And they have different names, so they're not attached to these. This is a document that shows the different sizes that I was referencing of the hyperscale data center. So you have the little small portable ones, right? They're looking at 0.1 to 2 megawatts, all the way up to the hyperscale data center, which is 50 to 200 plus megawatts, right? And now we're looking at even larger than 50 to 100 or to 200 megawatts. So just showing folks that. But from there, we have to be able to, well, let me backtrack a minute here. Just going over the quick impacts with the little time that we have. So there's sound pollution that's tied to these hyperscale data centers. There's light pollution that's tied to it, air pollution, the water contamination, the water waste, increased electricity bills, power outages. There's even stories of the stress that the United States has an extremely old and outdated grid, electricity grid, right? In some communities, even older than that, especially when you look at reservations. And so there's stories of when you flood that much electricity into the grid, an old and outdated grid, homes will start on fire because they do not have the updated electricity in there, our infrastructure in there to actually be able to hold that much energy flooding through, right? And so there are stories of fires. And so especially for Native communities, poor and low income communities, we're looking at homes who do not have the updates, right? And so we're also looking at the promise of economic development and the promise of jobs, which there are little to no jobs beyond the initial construction phase, right? So there's stories, and we have very specific examples of stories where there's 1,500 jobs for construction. And then once construction is done, within anywhere from 6 months to a 2-year time frame, there's maybe 100 jobs. But in Rapid City, South Dakota, very specifically, the company itself said at the end of construction, there will be 3 full-time jobs available for that hyperscale data center, right? So the economic benefit is very limited and short term. Also, you're looking at the health. There's several different reports that are coming out now where hyperscale data centers are tied to rare forms of cancers, very specifically around our lungs and breathing, asthma, things like that. Also, the fact that these companies are using NDAs. So again, I named the 5 hyperscalers on the previous slide, but they are not using those names. They're using subsidiary names. And then in addition to that, they're operating in secrecy because they will approach city council members, our regulatory bodies, or tribal councils, and they will come with NDAs, non-disclaimer agreements in hand, and they will not move forward until those are signed. And so what that does is it makes people who are supposed to represent us and make decisions on our behalf unaccountable to us. It makes them accountable to those corporations, right? So those are just a few impacts and from the hyperscale data center itself. But when you're looking at the infrastructure, again, I started with generative AI, creating the demand for the need for the hyperscale data center to house this new data that's coming, right? But then you have to power that. And you also have to create the servers. You have to create the GPUs. You have to create the chips. You have to create the air conditioners, right? So that's increasing the demand for critical minerals mining, right? So data centers, like this says, requires large amounts of energy and mineral resources to build. And this is the so-called critical minerals, right? The other thing to connect this back to nuclear as well is that uranium was just recently added to the critical minerals list in the so-called United States. And so that is also happening in real time. And just looking at the attacks on Indigenous lands, like where do we think that these, where do we think that these critical minerals are going to come from? Right now, the majority of these critical minerals come from out of country, right? But there's this big push right now for things to be domestic. And so if it becomes domestic and they start to mine more so here in the US, which they already are, then you're looking at native lands, right? The uranium that we know, the long history of uranium mining on native lands, especially our Dene relatives of the South, our relatives over in South Dakota, my relatives, our community, right? So we're going to start to see the uptick in this, naming like Oak Flat, right? Copper. Rio Tinto is targeting Oak Flat, which is Apache territory, to mine copper, right? So we're going to start seeing that a lot more in the targeting of native lands, a lot more through the demand for critical minerals for these hyperscale data centers. Moving forward to how we power these data centers. The hyperscale data centers have a massive demand for energy and electricity, right? And so we're starting to see utility companies merge with other utility companies so that way they can actually create these large conglomerates and they can start to bid for the hyperscale data centers. As of right now, there's already one incident or one case where utilities companies have actually chosen to power a hyperscale data center over the community that it has already served. And so Lake Tahoe is one of those communities where now all of their residents have till the end of 2026 to figure out how they're going to get their electricity, because their current utilities company is no longer going to power their homes. It's going to solely power a hyperscale data center, right? And so we're starting to see those things happen and play out in real time. The energy demand, though, brings into conversation, the expansion of coal. So we're seeing a lot of federal regulation that is revitalizing the coal industry and keeping it alive. We're looking at the expansion of frac gas, the use of hydrogen gas. And so it's really important to track that they have a major energy demand. The other thing that we're watching is the greenwashing, right? So to power this, they're starting to name nuclear as a clean energy, right? And greenwashing that so that way they can utilize it and justify and say, actually, we're not going to, impact the environment negatively because this is a carbon-free energy. And so they're utilizing that narrative to push this forward, right? And then you have the whole conversation around the small modular reactors that we just went through, and utilizing those rather than the large scale nuclear power plants that already exist, right? And so that was what kind of introduced me to this conversation, was the conversation of small modular reactors. We're also looking at what's not on here is diesel. And so oftentimes these hyperscale data centers, because they won't have the energy that they need immediately, or because of blackouts or things like that, they'll shift over to backup generators, which use diesel. And so they use a large amount of diesel as well to power these centers, and what that emits into the air. And then connecting that, the hyperscale data centers and generative AI. So we started with generative AI, creating the demand for the hyperscale data center. And that creates more of a demand for critical minerals for all of the components. That creates more of a demand for energy to power the data centers. And then that also is linked to militarism and surveillance, right? And so really looking at the fact that things like flock, right? These cameras are being utilized, and the data that is accessed through these security cameras is being used and handed over to ICE and then turned around and used to violate the rights of our peoples, right? So there's that. In addition to that, with the military, right now, we're starting to see that there's large language models, which is generative AI, being trained to identify targets, right? Without human oversight. They're also being trained to make decisions about what is considered an acceptable loss of human life. So they are making autonomous decisions about, okay, we can sacrifice 100 of our soldiers if we get this target, right? That's already happening. We've seen it happen with Iran, right? When we first bombed the girls' school, and that was in the news, that was actually AI making a decision about that using outdated data, right? There used to be a weapons depot nearby historically, and there is no longer one there. There was a girls' school. And so AI made this decision about bombing that location and using it as a target. And the result was atrocious, right? The loss of human life. And so just to name that, there are connections of generative AI that go all the way to militarism and loss of human life and the dehumanization of our peoples, right? So making those connections. So I went through that extremely fast. I apologize for that. We're running out of time. We're already over time. But I just really want to bring back to the emphasize the fact that generative AI is deeply, deeply connected to the nuclear industry. This is like the driving force. In fact, here in Montana, there's a 20-year plan that's in place right now. And their whole plan is solely around nuclear and also hyperscale data centers. And that's what they're looking and projecting for our communities far into the future. And I imagine many other communities across the so-called US. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Krystal, and to all of our speakers. This was a tremendous amount of information. We did get a lot of great questions, but in the interest of time, we will wrap up here shortly. Just keep an eye out for an email from Columbia Riverkeeper. We will be sharing resources, including on the topics that all of our speakers touched on, as well as links to petitions, opportunities to take action, or organizations to support if these, the issues that we touched on are of interest. So yes, and please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there are still 150 people there. I'm happy to stay to answer a few questions.
Okay.
Krystal, I'm so sorry it took so much time. Your presentation was so much more valuable than mine. I learned so much.
That
I
sounds
just want
great.
to say
Yeah.
that
Well,
publicly.
thank you. Yeah, well, let's stick around for a little bit longer and get through some of the questions. There were many. Um, so one of the questions that came through is, um, in with the recent vitrification efforts at Hanford, Simone, the question was, have they put a dent in the Hanford waste problem?
As briefly as possible, they started running the low activity vitrification smelters, and there is so much waste being generated, secondary sources, and through adding water to the tanks in order to mobilize the waste stream to get it through the vitrification plant, that it's really hard to say if there's been an actual dent in the waste problem or more of a transformation of the waste into different forms on site. I think, it started running in October, and there's 177 tanks. So I think it's maybe a little too early to say if there's been a dent, but some waste is being vitrified, definitely. And we'll see how it goes.
Great. Thank you so much for that. We had several folks in the audience who had questions, and I think, Krystal, Simone, others, if you want to weigh in on this, when it comes to SMNRs or SMRs, if it turns out that they ultimately are not built, where will data centers, like for example, Amazon's data centers are proposed in Washington, Oregon, where will they receive their energy? Any speculation on that?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing, like I said, with, these power companies are being forced into making decisions about where they're going to get more money, right? And so they're actually, if one is not built, if an SMNR is not built, they're going to continue to utilize the energy that currently exists and just funnel it to the hyperscale data center. So that means frac gas pipelines, oil pipelines. That means, the expansion of coal, or at least like keeping it alive longer, right? And it's also going to look like companies making the decisions of who they're going to power, the civilian population or a hyperscale data center, which as of right now, they're already making those decisions.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is, given the record that I talked about nuclear power, if small modular reactors actually get built, or big ones in Texas, they want to build big ones for the data center over there, there is going to be a long time. Most of these reactors will not get built. So what's going to happen is what looks like an interim fossil fuel transition to nuclear power is likely to be fossil fuels powering data centers. So I think Crystal is absolutely right.
Great, thank you. And then we'll wrap up with a question that was really directed at Columbia Riverkeeper. So Simone, I'll pitch it over to you here, which is, there's been a lot happening in the Oregon legislature in recent years related to SMRs. Um, has Columbia Riverkeeper, or what's happening in that realm? Are there actions that have been taken, success stories that we can share?
Yeah, so Columbia Riverkeeper has been really active in both the Oregon and the Washington legislature. Our policy director, Kelly Campbell, actually just got back from DC, where she went with the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, with one other Washington-based group who works on Hanford, which is Hanford Challenge, to talk to our representatives about the need for Hanford cleanup and that Hanford should not be a place for new nuclear reactors, or anywhere in our region. And yeah, there is a lot of info on our website about those efforts and a lot of bills in both Oregon and Washington that were defeated. And I think the main one that I would lift up as a story is that Oregon's moratorium on new nuclear is still in place, and remains so even after attempts, 13, was it 13 or 17 bill attempts in just Oregon? So definitely a success.
Great. Well, again, thank you everyone for sticking around, for your interest in these really important topics. And also, again, keep an eye out for that email, follow Columbia Riverkeeper on social media for opportunities to take action and to learn more about the topics that our speakers touched on today. And just close out with a thank you to our panelists. Really appreciate the incredible information that you shared and your willingness to stay a little bit longer to answer questions. So thank you. Hope everyone